Get ready for a Civil War thriller that will keep you on the edge of your seat. When Union scouts stumble upon a secret Confederate vault, they uncover more than just gold and weapons. They find secrets that could alter the entire course of the war. This explosive tale of espionage, betrayal, and unexpected alliances proves that sometimes the greatest discoveries come from the most dangerous places. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell for more historical adventures where one discovery can change everything. The Vault of Secrets. Chapter 1. Beneath the magnolia tree, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Sterling wiped the sweat from his brow as his small reconnaissance unit picked their way through the dense Georgia countryside. 3 days' hard ride behind Confederate lines, and still no closer to locating the rumored supply depot that Union intelligence insisted was operating somewhere between Milledgeville and Augusta. The August heat was merciless, turning their blue uniforms into furnaces and making every breath feel like inhaling liquid fire. But Sterling's orders had been explicit: find the Confederate supply network that was keeping General Hood's forces equipped despite the Union blockade's stranglehold on southern ports. Sterling commanded 8 hand-picked men from the 2nd Ohio Cavalry, volunteers who had distinguished themselves in previous reconnaissance missions through hostile territory. They were skilled at moving unseen, gathering intelligence, and fighting their way out when stealth failed. Exactly the kind of soldiers needed for deep penetration missions that regular army units couldn't accomplish. But 3 days of careful searching had yielded nothing except abandoned farmsteads and the occasional Confederate patrol that they'd managed to avoid through superior fieldcraft and pure luck. "Sir," Sergeant Thomas Murphy called quietly from his position near a massive magnolia tree that dominated the small clearing where they had stopped to rest their horses. "You need to see this." Sterling approached the tree, noting immediately what had caught Murphy's attention. The ground around the magnolia's base showed signs of recent excavation, not the kind of digging that might result from agricultural work, but carefully concealed disturbance that suggested someone had been burying or retrieving something substantial. More tellingly, several of the tree's lower branches bore fresh cuts where someone had removed foliage to provide better access to the base of the trunk. "How recent?" Sterling asked, kneeling to examine the disturbed earth more closely. "Days, maybe a week at most," Murphy replied. "And sir, look at this." He pointed to faint tracks in the soft soil, boot prints, and what appeared to be the marks of heavy objects being dragged across the ground. Whatever they buried here, it was big enough to require multiple men to handle. Sterling studied the evidence with the careful attention of someone whose survival had depended on reading landscape like a book. The tracks suggested at least 6 men, possibly more, working to move something that weighed enough to leave distinct drag marks in the clay soil. Most significantly, the pattern of disturbance indicated they had been digging up rather than burying down, retrieving something that had been hidden for some time. "Spread out and search the area," Sterling ordered quietly. "Look for anything that might indicate what was stored here or where it might have been taken, and keep watch for Confederate patrols. If this location was important enough to require excavation, it might still be under observation." His men began their systematic search with the practiced efficiency of soldiers accustomed to gathering intelligence under pressure. Sterling found himself drawn back to the magnolia tree itself, studying its massive trunk and the way its spreading branches would have provided perfect concealment for nighttime activities. Someone had chosen this location very carefully, using natural features to hide work that clearly needed to remain secret. Private Williams emerged from a thicket of undergrowth, carrying something metallic that glinted in the filtered sunlight. "Colonel, I found this about 20 yards from the tree. Looks like it broke off whatever they were moving." The object was a brass corner fitting, ornately decorated with scrollwork that suggested expensive craftsmanship rather than military utility. Sterling turned it over in his hands, noting that one edge had been freshly broken and that the metal showed signs of being buried for an extended period. The piece was clearly part of something larger, a chest or strongbox that had suffered damage during its recent removal. "Sir," Corporal Jackson called from the opposite edge of the clearing, "there's a trail leading northeast. Looks like they used a wagon to transport whatever they dug up." Sterling joined Jackson to examine the wagon tracks, which were indeed clearly visible once you knew what to look for. Heavy wheels had pressed deep into the soft earth, and the spacing suggested a substantial vehicle capable of carrying significant weight. More importantly, the tracks were recent enough to follow, leading in the direction of the main road that connected Milledgeville to the smaller towns, scattered throughout central Georgia. "Mount up," Sterling ordered. "We follow the trail until we find where it leads, or until we encounter opposition too strong to handle. Whatever the Confederates removed from this location, it was important enough to risk moving it in broad daylight. I want to know what we're dealing with." The trail led them northeast for nearly 2 hours, winding through countryside that showed increasing signs of Confederate military activity. They passed abandoned campsites, discarded equipment, and the occasional burned-out farmstead that suggested recent fighting in the area. Sterling began to worry that they were approaching a major Confederate position, which would make their small unit situation increasingly dangerous. The wagon tracks eventually led to an old plantation manor that had clearly seen better days. The main house was partially burned, its once grand columns blackened by fire and its windows boarded up with rough planks. But the grounds showed signs of recent occupation, tent sites, cooking fires, and the kind of organized activity that suggested military use rather than civilian habitation. "That's where they brought it," Murphy observed, studying the manor through his field glasses. "Question is, what did they do with it once they got it here?" Sterling was wondering the same thing when the sound of approaching horses made the decision for him. A Confederate patrol was riding directly toward their position, moving with the confident bearing of soldiers operating in friendly territory. 8 grey-uniformed cavalry were coming up the main road, clearly intending to visit the manor. "Take cover," Sterling whispered urgently. "Let them pass and see what they're up to." His men melted into the underbrush with the practiced invisibility of veteran scouts, leaving only their eyes visible as they watched the Confederate patrol approach the manor. The riders dismounted near what had once been the main entrance, and Sterling could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the humid air. "Told you the colonel would want to see this personally," one of the Confederates was saying as they approached the house. "Once he understands what we've found, it'll change everything about how Richmond approaches this war." The statement sent a chill through Sterling's chest. Whatever the Confederates had retrieved from beneath the magnolia tree, it was significant enough to warrant personal attention from high-ranking officers and potentially important enough to influence Confederate strategy. That made it a priority target for Union intelligence, regardless of the risks involved in acquiring it. The Confederate patrol disappeared into the burned manor house, emerging 20 minutes later with expressions of obvious excitement and urgency. Their leader, a captain whose uniform bore the insignia of a Georgia regiment, was carrying a leather document case that he guarded with obvious care. "Ride hard for Augusta," the captain ordered his men. "General Hill needs to see this immediately. And remember, not a word about this to anyone below colonel rank. What we've found here could turn the tide of the entire war." As the Confederate patrol departed at a gallop toward Augusta, Sterling found himself facing one of the most difficult decisions of his military career. His orders had been to locate Confederate supply lines, not to pursue mysterious discoveries that might or might not be strategically significant. But the urgency in the Confederate captain's voice and the obvious importance attached to whatever they had found suggested that this represented a far more valuable intelligence opportunity than simple supply interdiction. "Sir," Murphy whispered, What are your orders? Do we try to infiltrate that manor and see what they left behind, or do we report back about the Confederate activity in this area? Sterling studied the partially burned manor house, weighing the potential intelligence value against the considerable risks of attempting to search a location that was clearly under Confederate surveillance. The smart military decision would be to return to Union lines with information about Confederate movements in the area. The potentially war-changing decision would be to investigate what the Confederates had considered important enough to risk exposing with their dramatic statements about turning the tide of the conflict. We investigate, Sterling decided. Whatever the Confederates found under that tree, it's important enough to potentially justify the risks. But we do this carefully, and we maintain escape routes at all times. If we encounter resistance we can't handle, we retreat immediately and report what we've observed. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the abandoned plantation, Sterling's small unit prepared to enter what might be either an intelligence goldmine or a carefully prepared trap. The burned manor house waited in the gathering dusk like a monument to the war's capacity for destruction, holding secrets that could indeed change everything about how the conflict would be fought and won. Subscribe for the next chapter of this Civil War thriller. What secrets lie hidden in the burned manor? Will Sterling's discovery live up to the Confederate captain's dramatic claims? Click the notification bell so you never miss our historical adventures where one discovery can reshape the course of history. Chapter 2. The Documents of Destiny. The approach to the manor house required 2 hours of careful maneuvering through terrain that offered little concealment and multiple opportunities for Confederate sentries to spot approaching intruders. Sterling divided his men into 3 groups. Murphy and 2 others would circle to the rear of the building. Jackson and Williams would establish an observation post with the horses, while Sterling himself would lead the direct approach with Corporals Mason and Rodriguez providing close support. The burned sections of the manor had left the structure partially open to the elements, with gaping holes in the roof and walls that provided multiple entry points, but also created acoustic challenges that made silent movement nearly impossible. Sterling could see lamplight flickering through the boarded windows, indicating that someone was indeed inside the building despite the Confederate patrol's departure. Moving with the patient precision of soldiers accustomed to hostile territory, Sterling's group reached the manor's foundation and began working their way along the fire-damaged walls toward what appeared to be a servant's entrance. The wooden door hung crooked on damaged hinges, providing just enough gap to allow visual reconnaissance of the interior. Through the opening, Sterling could see a single Confederate soldier, an older man whose sergeant's stripes suggested experience rather than ambition. He was sitting beside a wooden table that bore obvious signs of recent use, reading what appeared to be official correspondence by the light of a kerosene lamp. More significantly, the table also held an open strongbox that clearly corresponded to the brass fitting Williams had found near the magnolia tree. The strongbox appeared to be nearly empty, its contents apparently transferred to the document case the Confederate captain had carried away. But Sterling could see papers scattered around the table, suggesting that not everything had been removed. Whatever intelligence opportunity existed lay in those remaining documents, and whatever else might be hidden in the partially searched strongbox. The challenge was neutralizing the guard without alerting any additional Confederate forces that might be stationed nearby. Sterling studied the man's position, noting that he was positioned to observe the main entrance, but with his back to the servants' door, where they were concealed. A silent approach was possible, but it would require perfect execution to avoid raising an alarm that could bring Confederate reinforcements. Sterling signaled his intentions to Mason and Rodriguez, then began the careful process of working the damaged door open far enough to allow entry. The wood creaked ominously as it moved, but the sound was covered by wind through the damaged roof and the guard's own movements as he shuffled through the papers on the table. The approach across the fire-damaged floor required navigating around debris and burned timbers that could easily create noise if disturbed. Sterling moved with the patient deliberation of someone who understood that haste often led to discovery, and discovery often led to death. Each footstep was carefully placed, each movement calculated to minimize sound and maintain concealment until the final moment. The Confederate sergeant never heard them coming. Sterling's arm circled his throat in a practiced chokehold that rendered him unconscious within seconds, while Mason and Rodriguez secured the room and began gathering the scattered documents. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute, leaving them in possession of the guard and access to whatever intelligence he had been protecting. "Sir," Rodriguez whispered urgently, "you need to see this." Sterling joined his corporal at the table, where Rodriguez was holding a partially burned document that appeared to be written in some kind of code. But even without deciphering the coded portions, certain elements were clearly readable. Dates, locations, and most significantly, references to what appeared to be a coordinated plan involving multiple Confederate armies operating across different theaters of the war. "There's more," Mason added, carefully lifting papers from the strongbox. "Maps, troop dispositions, and what looks like correspondence between Richmond and field commanders discussing operations we've never heard intelligence reports about." Sterling began examining the documents systematically, his excitement growing as he realized the scope of what they had discovered. The papers represented not just tactical intelligence about local Confederate operations, but strategic information about Confederate planning at the highest levels. There were references to coordinated operations between Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and forces operating in the Western Theater, details about supply networks that Union intelligence had never identified, and most startling of all, what appeared to be plans for operations that wouldn't take place for months. "This isn't just battlefield intelligence," Sterling murmured as he studied a map that showed Confederate positions extending far beyond anything Union command had suspected. "This is comprehensive strategic planning, possibly direct from Jefferson Davis himself." The implications were staggering. If the documents were genuine, and their discovery hidden beneath a magnolia tree suggested considerable effort to keep them secret, then Union forces had been operating with a fundamentally incomplete understanding of Confederate capabilities and intentions. The coordination between different Confederate armies was far more sophisticated than anyone in Washington had imagined, and Confederate strategic planning extended much further into the future than Union intelligence had estimated. "Sir," Mason whispered from his position watching the main entrance, "we have company approaching. Looks like another Confederate patrol, bigger than the last one." Sterling quickly assessed their situation. They had obtained potentially war-changing intelligence, but they were trapped in a partially destroyed building with an unconscious Confederate guard and a patrol approaching that would certainly investigate any irregularities. Escape with the documents would require either fighting their way out against superior numbers or finding an alternative route that wouldn't expose them to direct confrontation. "Gather everything," Sterling ordered quietly. "Maps, documents, anything that looks official. We'll sort through it later once we're clear of this area." His men worked with efficient urgency, stuffing papers into their uniform pockets and saddlebags, while Sterling made the difficult decision about what to do with their unconscious prisoner. Military doctrine suggested that leaving him alive risked exposure of their mission. But killing an unconscious man violated principles Sterling had maintained throughout his military service. "We tie him up and gag him," Sterling decided. "Buy ourselves time to get clear before he can raise an alarm." The approaching Confederate patrol was close enough now that Sterling could hear individual voices and the jingle of equipment that suggested a substantial force, probably a full company responding to reports of Union scouts in the area. His own unit needed to reach their horses and begin moving toward Union lines before the Confederates discovered their infiltration of the manor house. Murphy's group appeared at the rear entrance just as Sterling's team finished securing their prisoner and gathering the last of the documents. "Sir, there's at least 30 Confederates surrounding this place. We need to move now if we're going to get out clean." Sterling made a final sweep of the strongbox, confirming that they had captured everything of potential intelligence value. The haul was extraordinary. Enough strategic information to potentially reshape Union understanding of Confederate capabilities and planning. But it would only be valuable if they could successfully transport it back to Union command. "Move out through the rear," Sterling ordered. "We'll use the woods to screen our withdrawal and try to reach the horses before they realize we've been here." As they prepared to leave the manor house, Sterling took one last look at the documents they had captured. The coded portions would require expert analysis, but the portions he could read suggested intelligence discoveries that could indeed change the course of the war. Confederate planning was far more sophisticated and far-reaching than Union leadership had imagined, and the coordination between different armies suggested strategic thinking that went well beyond the tactical considerations that had dominated Union assessments of Confederate capabilities. The escape through the woods required 40 minutes of careful movement through terrain that offered concealment, but also numerous opportunities for Confederate searchers to intercept them. Sterling could hear the sounds of organized search activity behind them: dogs, mounted patrols, and the systematic beating of underbrush that suggested the Confederates understood they were dealing with Union infiltrators rather than casual intruders. When they finally reached their horses, Jackson reported that Confederate activity in the area had increased dramatically over the past hour. "Sir, there are patrols on all the main roads and mounted searches covering the secondary trails. Whatever we found in that house, they want it back badly enough to commit serious resources to hunting us down." Sterling studied his map by moonlight, calculating routes back to Union lines that would minimize exposure to Confederate search efforts while maximizing their chances of successfully delivering the captured intelligence. The documents they carried could potentially reshape Union strategy, but only if they survived long enough to present them to officers capable of understanding their significance. Don't miss the next chapter. Will Sterling's unit escape with their explosive discovery? What secrets in the Confederate documents will change the war's direction? Subscribe now and hit the bell icon for more Civil War adventures where intelligence operations determine the fate of nations. Chapter 3. The intelligence that changed everything. The race back to Union lines became a deadly game of cat and mouse across 60 miles of hostile Georgian countryside, with Confederate search parties closing in from multiple directions as word spread about the intelligence breach at the manor house. Sterling's small unit was forced to abandon the main roads entirely, navigating by compass through swamplands and dense forests that offered concealment but also slowed their progress to a crawl. By dawn of their second day of flight, they had covered less than 20 miles and could hear Confederate bloodhounds baying in the distance, a sound that meant their pursuers had found a scent trail and were gaining ground rapidly. Sterling made the difficult decision to split his forces, sending half his men southeast as decoys, while he continued north with the captured documents and his 3 most experienced soldiers. "Sir?" Murphy gasped during a brief rest beside a muddy creek. "Those papers must contain something extraordinary for the Confederates to commit this many resources to hunting us down. What exactly did we find in that strongbox?" Sterling had been studying the documents whenever circumstances permitted, and his growing understanding of their contents had left him both exhilarated and terrified. "Murphy, I think we've captured Jefferson Davis's personal correspondence with his field commanders. Strategic planning documents that show Confederate capabilities we never suspected and operations scheduled months in advance." The sergeant's eyes widened as he absorbed the implications. "Sir, are you saying the Confederates have been playing a longer game than we realized? Much longer and much more sophisticated." Sterling carefully refolded a document that appeared to outline coordinated operations between Confederate armies in Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia. Operations designed to draw Union forces into favorable terrain for Confederate counterattacks. Richmond has been planning integrated campaigns across multiple theaters, while we've been treating each army as an independent problem. The sound of approaching horses forced them back into motion, but Sterling's mind continued to race through the implications of what they had discovered. The Confederate strategic vision was far more comprehensive than Union intelligence had ever suspected, incorporating political considerations, international diplomacy, and economic warfare in ways that suggested sophisticated understanding of how modern conflicts were actually won and lost. One document in particular had captured Sterling's attention, a coded letter that appeared to discuss Confederate contacts with European powers and potential intervention that went far beyond the diplomatic recognition that Union leadership had been worried about. If the document was genuine, Confederate agents were negotiating for direct military assistance that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the war. "Colonel," Corporal Rodriguez whispered urgently, "movement ahead. Looks like Confederate cavalry blocking our route north." Sterling studied the terrain ahead, noting that they had walked into exactly the kind of tactical trap that the captured documents suggested Confederate forces were increasingly sophisticated at setting. The main route toward Union lines was blocked, forcing them to choose between eastern and western alternatives that would expose them to additional Confederate forces positioned to intercept fleeing Union scouts. "We go east," Sterling decided after studying his map. "It's the longer route, but it should keep us clear of the heaviest Confederate concentrations until we reach Sherman's advance units." The eastern route led them through territory that had been devastated by previous military campaigns, burned farmsteads, abandoned towns, and countryside that bore the scars of armies that had passed through, taking whatever they needed and destroying what they couldn't use. The desolation provided cover for their movement, but also created an eerie landscape that reminded all of them how much destruction this war had already caused. As they picked their way through the ruins of what had once been a prosperous farming community, Sterling found himself thinking about the broader implications of the intelligence they carried. The Confederate strategic planning revealed in the captured documents suggested that the war would continue far longer than Union leadership expected, with Confederate forces prepared to conduct coordinated operations that could potentially reverse recent Union gains. More troubling still were the references to Confederate preparations for guerrilla warfare in the event that conventional operations became unsustainable. The documents suggested that Confederate leadership was planning for scenarios where Southern armies would dissolve into partisan units operating behind Union lines, a development that could turn military victory into political nightmare for the Lincoln administration. "Sir," Murphy called quietly from his position watching their backtrail, "I think we've lost the main pursuit. Haven't heard those dogs for over an hour, and I don't see any dust clouds that would indicate mounted forces." Sterling felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though he knew they wouldn't be truly safe until they reached Union territory. "Maintain vigilance," he ordered. "The Confederates know we're carrying something important, and they'll keep hunting until they either recapture it or confirm that we've reached Union lines." The final push toward Union territory required another full day of careful movement through countryside that showed increasing signs of Sherman's approaching forces. They began encountering Union cavalry patrols and advance scouts, clear indication that they had finally reached territory under federal control, but Sterling was taking no chances. The intelligence they carried was too valuable to risk losing to a Confederate raiding party or irregular forces operating behind supposed Union lines. The Union camp outside Milledgeville was a sprawling city of tents, supply wagons, and organized military activity that represented the largest concentration of federal forces Sterling had seen since leaving Ohio. More importantly, it was also the headquarters of General William Tecumseh Sherman himself, the officer best positioned to understand and act upon the strategic intelligence they had captured. Sterling's request for an immediate meeting with Sherman was initially met with skepticism from staff officers who were accustomed to routine intelligence reports from reconnaissance units. But mention of captured Confederate strategic documents and potential coordination between enemy armies quickly elevated his request to command-level attention. General Sherman received them in his command tent, surrounded by maps, dispatches, and the controlled chaos of an active military headquarters planning major operations. He was a lean, intense man whose penetrating stare suggested someone accustomed to cutting through military bureaucracy to focus on essential information. "Colonel Sterling," Sherman began without preamble, "my staff tells me you've captured documents that suggest Confederate strategic coordination we haven't previously identified. I hope for all our sakes that this intelligence justifies the dramatic claims being made about its importance." Sterling spread the captured documents across Sherman's campaign table, organizing them to demonstrate the scope and sophistication of Confederate planning. As Sherman studied the papers, his expression shifted from skeptical interest to genuine concern, and finally to something approaching alarm. "Good God," Sherman muttered, as he examined a document that appeared to outline Confederate plans for coordinated attacks on Union supply lines across multiple states. "If this is accurate, Richmond has been planning operations we won't see coming until they're already underway." For the next 2 hours, Sherman and his senior staff analyzed the captured intelligence, gradually building a picture of Confederate capabilities and intentions that differed dramatically from previous Union assessments. The coordination between Confederate armies was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, and Confederate strategic planning extended much further into the future than Union intelligence had estimated. "Colonel Sterling," Sherman said finally, "you and your men have captured intelligence that could indeed change how we conduct this war. This level of Confederate coordination requires completely different strategic thinking on our part." He paused, studying the documents once more. "I'm forwarding this immediately to Washington with recommendations for strategic adjustments that could prevent Confederate operations we now know are being planned." Sterling felt a mixture of relief and pride as he realized the mission had accomplished far more than anyone had dared to hope. What had begun as routine reconnaissance for Confederate supply lines had resulted in intelligence discoveries that could potentially reshape Union strategy and prevent Confederate operations that might otherwise have achieved surprise and devastating success. "Sir," Sterling said, "there's one more thing. The Confederate pursuit of our unit suggests they understand the significance of what we captured. They'll likely alter their plans now that they know their strategic documents have been compromised." Sherman nodded thoughtfully, "which means we need to act on this intelligence quickly before Confederate leadership can adapt to its compromise. Colonel, I'm promoting you to full colonel and assigning you to my intelligence staff. We're going to need officers who understand the significance of what you've discovered and can help us develop countermeasures for Confederate operations we now know are coming. Subscribe for more Civil War espionage thrillers. How will this intelligence discovery reshape the final years of the war? What new dangers await as both sides adapt to the changed strategic landscape? Hit the notification bell for historical adventures where intelligence operations determine the fate of nations.